Hello guys, welcome. Today's lesson is about free trade and protection. So mainly I would be talking about the increasing ease of travel, growing international trade and an increasing variety of goods and services. I'm talking about more opportunities for firms to buy and sell products in any country in the world, also about more opportunities for labor and capital to move anywhere in the world, and the growth of global financial markets. So, as you can notice, when I'm talking about free trade, I am talking about countries trading with each other or exchanging goods with each other without any barriers. Okay? Now, this happens because of something called globalization. Globalization is the increasing social, technological, political, and economic interdependence and interaction between people, firms, and entire economies around the world. Now, this happens through increase in connections between economies all around the world, okay, making the world smaller, but in reality, it is becoming bigger. So I'm talking, as you can see, about the integration of goods and services, also culture among nations of the world. Also, we have been experiencing globalization since the days of European colonization. So it's that old. But definitely, the advances in telecommunication and in transportation, this helped in accelerating globalization. Also, the internet has made all nations next door neighbors. Like any topic in economics, here we will be talking about advantages and disadvantages of globalization. So mainly I can view this as a discuss question. Let's start off by discussing the advantages of globalization. First of all, because of the development of new technology, this had led to easier and cheaper communication and even transportation and trade among countries. And because of that, this also has led to increase in wealth. And one more good thing for the people, because they've got variety of goods and services, they can buy their goods and services online. But remember, domestically speaking, this would lead to disadvantages. Okay, so because the people of the country would not be ordering the goods of their national country, they might be importing from others, since we find it easier in terms of transportation nowadays. Also, the planned economies, it became easier for them to transfer into a free market economy. Also, when I'm talking about globalization, you have to understand, and this is what we will be explaining later, there will be less trade barriers. So, no more obstacles. Okay? Now, let's move on to the disadvantages. So, however, globalization has some disadvantages, such as easier for countries to move to cheaper labor countries. And this means it would create unemployment in some countries and it would increase employment in others. Also, because of the factories that are operating worldwide, this had led to more pollution, and this will cause an external cost. Also, finally, the depletion of resources. Depletion of resources, we took that in Unit 2 when we started talking about factors of production. I'm sorry, in Unit 1. So remember, resources in general are considered to be scarce. And at that point, because they're being used up, I am using the resources at a faster rate. And this would lead to depletion of resources. Now, our second section of this chapter would be about multinational corporations. Multinational corporations have facilities and other assets in at least one country other than its home country. So mainly I would be talking about global businesses. Okay, so generally their offices or factories in different countries, and they have a centralized head office which is the mother office, in their original country. And at that point, they will be able to coordinate global management. Okay, so I can say that they own a number of companies, or I can call them subsidiary companies located in other countries in order to produce their goods and services. Now, for the multinational itself, what are the advantages of it? First, they have a greater customer service, customer number, which means they can reach many more customers or consumers globally. Also, because the multinational is too big, it can avoid trade barriers such as tariffs or quotas that we would be discussing later on. And other than that, they are operating in other countries, remember, so they don't need to actually import from the home country. And this would lead to less transport costs. Also, because they are operating in countries, which was one of the disadvantages of globalization, where they have cheaper labor costs, it would lead to lower wage costs, lower labor costs, okay? And because they're too big and they are making a lot of revenue and a lot of profit, they are able to invest in new capital and in new methods for research and development. And all of this would lead to lower average cost of production, which would eventually lead to economies of scale. Now, when I am talking about the MNCs, I will be talking about their host country. So the host country is the country that accepts the multinational to operate in them. So for example, if I want to talk about McDonald's, let's say, it originally started in the USA. This is its home country, and it is operating in the rest of the world. Now, when I want to talk about, let's say, McDonald's, let me say it operated in the UAE. UAE is considered to be its host country. Now, this host country would also face some benefits and some problems. This again, it is a perfect example of a discuss question. Let's start off by discussing the advantages to the host country. Since it's operating in it, it will definitely create employment, more employment in the country and more job opportunities. The second advantage would be investment, which we took in unit 2. It's foreign direct investment, which means the foreigner company here, which is the McDonald's, it is actually investing in our country and it is spending money in our country. And this will lead to a future return to the country. And this is better for the people in the country because they would have more variety of goods and services, which would lead to newer ideas, new technology being used, and even new skills. Again, when this MNC is operating, they are actually paying something called corporate tax to the government. So this will increase the government revenue. Okay? And finally, this would lead to opportunities for increased international trade, which means because as we said before, these MNCs are actually benefiting from economies of scale. Also, it would lead to competition, which is considered to be good in the country, and they will start probably exporting. So when they are exporting, they are increasing export earnings. Now, however, the MNCs can create problems to the host country. Why? Because, as we said, it is creating competition, but this competition may force local competitors out of the business. So this would affect domestic firms in the host country. Also, move profits between countries to avoid paying corporate taxes. So what they will be doing at that point, they might move their multinational to another country, which would lead to less employment and all the other disadvantages. The third problem would be they might use their power to get generous subsidies and even tax advantages from the host country. Because to the MNC, from the MNC's point of view, they are considering that they are doing the host country a favor because they are doing all of these advantages that we discussed before. The fourth disadvantage might be they might exploit workers in low wage economies. So, because they're massive firms and they might start massive factories, they have a lot of job opportunities. And as we said, they are operating in countries with lower labor cost, so they are taking advantage of these poor workers. And finally, it can exploit the natural resources of the country, and also, as we discussed before, which is the depletion of resources. And at the same time, this would create external costs, which is the damage to the environment that they are creating. Now, our second topic would be the benefits of free trade. When I'm talking about free trade, you got to understand that I'm talking about the movement and exchange of physical goods such as materials, component parts, equipment, and finished products. And also, it could be services, ideas, money, and labor across international borders. So, an exchange of goods and services between two people, businesses, or groups or countries, usually for money, I call that a trade process. Now, when I am talking about free trade, I'm talking about no more barriers between countries that are exchanging goods and services between each other. So this is international trade, which is, as you can see, movement and exchange of physical goods, services, and money across international borders. So automatically, when you hear the word trade, I am talking about two things: exports and imports. The exports is the sale of goods and services from your country to other countries, whereas imports is the purchase or buying of goods and services from another country to our country. What does it mean to talk about an open economy? So, it is a national economy that engages in trade with other economies. It has free trade with other countries, so they are more open, and this would lead to more trade between countries, and it causes disadvantages for local producers or domestic producers. And also, some countries introduce policies to restrict international trade. Why? Because they want to help their domestic industries. So right now we will be discussing the gains from international trade, or in other words, I can call it arguments for free trade. And it means I'm talking about something called an open economy. I have 6 advantages. First, it allows countries to benefit from specialization. What does this mean? So they can produce what they are best at, and this would lead to trade surplus. The second one would be it increases consumer choice. Let's remember, consumers can enjoy a greater variety of goods and services from across the world. The third one would be it increases competition and efficiency. So at that point, firms must improve their costs and product quality to compete with overseas producer. So this is a benefit to the consumer in the country as well. The fourth one would be it creates additional business and employment opportunities. Let's remember, new and existing firms can expand their sales to growing consumer markets overseas. The fifth one is it allows firms to access the best workforces, materials, and technologies from anywhere in the world. And finally, it's interdependency, which means countries can become friends. The second point would be I'm talking about the disadvantages of uncontrolled trade, or I can call it arguments against uncontrolled trade, or I could just simply be answering, why do we need to control trade? I need to control trade for four main reasons. The first one is when I am trading with low cost economies, it is considered to be threatening in many developed economies and reducing opportunities for less developed economies to grow their own industries. The second one would be, since trade is increasing, the rate at which we are depleting natural resources. So this is a big problem. I don't want to finish my resources at a much faster rate. Some countries would think it is better for them to keep them for future consumption. The third one would be trade may increase the exploitation of workers and the environment in many less developed economies, which we already explained previously when I was talking about the disadvantages of MNCs to the host country, as multinationals are attracted to them by low wage and taxes. Um, Finally, it has increased the gap between the rich and the poor nations. So the rich are becoming richer and the poorer countries are becoming poorer. Because the developed and rapidly developed economies, they are the ones that dominate the global demand for many natural resources, including timber, metal ores, and have used their purchasing power to force down their market prices. Now, this section we will be talking about what are the methods of protection for trade and what are the reasons of protection for trade, and also what are the consequences of the protection of trade. First, uh, kind of protection, it can be called tariffs. What are tariffs? Tariffs, you got to think of it as a trade barrier, which is considered to be an indirect tax on the prices of imported goods. And why do they do that? Because I want to discourage the demand of these imported goods and increase the consumption of domestic goods and services in my country. But sometimes when we impose tariffs, it results in something called retaliation, which means imposing the tariffs often results in affected overseas countries imposing tariffs of their own as well. So because you put a tariff, I will be putting a tariff as well. Now let's have a look at the non-tariff barriers. We've got four different kinds of non-tariff barriers. The first one is considered to be subsidies. Subsidies are government grants paid to domestic producers to reduce their production costs in order to enable them to sell their products at lower prices than overseas producers. And remember, when I'm talking about the subsidy, the government is only giving it to domestic firms. The second one is quota restricted supply of imports. What is a quota? A quota is a limit on quantity of goods imported. Okay, so they put a limit on the volume of an imported good allowed into a country. So they make less goods imported. The third one would be an embargo, or I can consider it a ban. So it's either or. So what does this mean? There would be a ban on the imports of products from overseas countries. It is not allowed to enter this country, this particular brand, or we do not want to import from that particular country. So at that point, what are they doing? In general, when I am using tariffs or non-tariff barriers, it means I don't want to trade with other countries. I actually want to increase the demand on our domestic firms. And the fourth one, which is a non-tariff barrier, it's considered unreasonable quality controls. What do they do here? they put very, very, very high standards on the quality of the product in order to be allowed into our country. So standards and licensing the requirements for important goods would be extremely high. And this would make the import of goods into my country more difficult and even costly. And excessive quality standards would, you know, tell the other country, خلاص, I don't want to export to that particular country. They are actually asking for a lot of requirements, and I would rather not do it. Okay, so this is an example about it. Now, this is a very important part of the lesson, and this is a perfect discuss question where I would be talking about the advantages of using trade barriers and why is it bad to use trade barriers. So I made it in a form of a table. Okay, first I will start talking about the advantages of using trade barriers, or in other words, I can call it arguments for trade protection or trade barriers. The first one is to protect something known as infant or sunrise industry. This means I'm talking about new and slow firms that are hoping to grow. Okay, the second point is we want to protect something known as sunset industries, and those are the industries that are on a declining stage. So they would still employ many people, and closure of these firms in the industry will result in high regional unemployment. And definitely the government does not want that. The third point would be to protect something known as strategic industries. I'm talking about important industries in the country, such as, for example, agriculture, such as energy, defense equipment, and so on. So, important strategic industries in the country that the government wants to protect them. The fourth one would be to protect the domestic firms from something known as dumping. Uh, Dumping is a form of predatory pricing. We took it in previous lessons. It involves one country flooding another with a product at a price significantly below its market price to force the rival producers out of the business. The fifth one is to limit something known as over specialization. So, trade barriers can help a country to maintain a wider range of different industries to reduce the risk of its main industry failing or declining due to overseas competition. And finally, to correct trade imbalance, so either by reducing the amount of imports or by reducing the amount of imports coming into the country. Because remember, one of the main macroeconomic objectives is for balance of trade. So if I am having an imbalance, this is not good at all for the government's macroeconomic objectives to achieve. Now, let's move on to the however part. What are the arguments against protectionism or trade barriers? So, or in other words, what are the disadvantages of using trade barriers? It restricts consumer choice. The second one, it restricts new business opportunities. There will be, so in terms of revenue and employment opportunities, it reduces the gains from trade. The third one is it protects inefficient domestic firms. Uh, they will be protected from this overseas competition, and they will continue to be inefficient since there is no competition. And the fourth one, or the last one, is retaliation, which means other affected countries will retaliate against trade barriers. Now, there's something I want to talk about. It's called breaking down barriers, which means I'm talking about something called trade liberalization, which involves the removal of barriers to trade between different countries in order to improve the global allocation of resources and to allow economies to realize gains from increased trade and market access. We're done with the chapter, and this is like a summary of everything we've taken. I usually call this a mind map. Okay, so as you can see, the most important thing we were talking about in this chapter is globalization, free trade, and protection. I want to talk about free trade advantages and disadvantages, so please pause the video and have a look at them. And then I want to talk about what are the trade barriers. These subsidies, quotas, embargo, and excessive quality standards are known to be non-tariffs. Tariffs is the amount the tax that they put on imported goods. Okay, what are the reasons governments would want to use trade barriers, and what are the consequences? What are the effects of it? When I am talking about multinationals, I want to talk about the home country. What are the advantages and disadvantages, and what are the advantages and disadvantages to the host country? That would be it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a nice day.